The moment Karen's shrill voice crackled through my security system, announcing that she had already called 911 to evict my wife from our own home, I knew the next few hours were going to redefine everything we thought we knew about our so-called peaceful neighborhood, because nothing in the pristine rows of HOA-approved hedges, the perfectly paved streets, or the freshly painted mailboxes could prepare anyone for the chaos that was about to unfold when you accidentally pick a fight with someone who doesn't just hold power in the state but embodies it. And my wife, Lieutenant Commander Eleanor Hart of the State Police Force, was about to remind everyone in our entire county that bureaucracy, privilege, and loud-mouthed entitlement meet their match when crossed, especially when the person they try to intimidate literally commands the very law enforcement network that HOA Karen had naively assumed she could manipulate with a phone call and a few exaggerated accusations, because Karen had always been the type to think her little gold-plated HOA badge gave her authority over everyone, assuming that screaming into the phone was equivalent to wielding legal power, and she had no idea that when she dialed 911, she wasn't summoning a timid dispatcher or a local beat cop. She was poking a hornet's nest that spanned the state police hierarchy, and that my wife had already anticipated every possible scenario, from rogue HOA members trying to storm our gate to the legal ramifications of filing a false complaint, which Eleanor had memorized during her years running operations that involved everything from hostage negotiations to statewide criminal investigations. And as the minutes ticked by, I watched Karen pacing frantically in her manicured yard, her heels clacking against the driveway in a rhythm that could only be described as the prelude to disaster, while my wife, calm as a glacier, moved through the house with the kind of precision that made me realize that any normal person who had just heard that the HOA had called 911 to remove them would have panicked, would have locked doors, would have barricaded windows. But Eleanor didn't need any of that, because she had a network in place that could respond before Karen could even finish her sentence. And it wasn't just the police presence that made me feel a mix of awe and relief. It was the way Eleanor's mind worked in real time, analyzing every potential weakness in Karen's plan, every loophole in HOA bylaws, every possible way a call to the local sheriff could backfire on someone who was clearly acting outside of her authority. And as the first patrol car rounded the corner, lights flashing but tires silent on the asphalt, I realized that Karen had dramatically underestimated one key fact. My wife had not only the authority to counteract her, but the resources, the knowledge, and the temperament to make the entire neighborhood witness the fallout of her overconfidence. And it began with a phone call that Eleanor placed to the county's Emergency Operations Center, delivered in a voice so commanding that even the most seasoned officers on duty paused mid-conversation, confirming every suspicion, cross-referencing every complaint, and logging every falsehood Karen had spouted, while simultaneously coordinating discreet units to arrive at our home in less than 5 minutes to ensure that no unauthorized individual could trespass, which meant that by the time Karen finally stormed toward our front door, convinced she was about to enforce some imagined rule, she was met not with an empty house but with 3 state police cruisers, strategically positioned, lights off, engines humming like predators waiting for prey, and every officer in place because my wife had anticipated Karen's every move hours before the first complaint was ever made. And when Karen reached the front steps, phone still clutched in her hand, ready to call for backup that would never arrive in time, Eleanor stepped onto the porch, dressed in casual but unmistakably authoritative attire, her presence alone radiating the kind of power that immediately disarmed any normal human being, which Karen, unfortunately for herself, was not. And as Eleanor calmly explained that the HOA had no legal right to demand her removal, that the complaint was being officially logged as harassment, and that any attempt to force entry would result in immediate arrest, Karen's face went through a spectrum of disbelief, anger, and panic that was almost cinematic in its clarity, a combination of someone realizing they had misjudged their opponent, that their assumptions about influence and control had been catastrophically wrong, and that the consequences of their arrogance were about to unfold in real time before the entire neighborhood, whose residents had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the flashing lights and the escalating commotion, all whispering, pointing, and recording on phones because no one could believe that an HOA conflict had escalated to the kind of standoff that looked like it belonged in a television drama. And yet, there we were, because Karen had not considered the most important factor. My wife's authority was not a bluff, it was real, it was comprehensive, and it operated on a level that Karen could neither intimidate nor negotiate with. And as Eleanor spoke calmly, almost conversationally, laying out the legal ramifications, the enforcement protocols, and the fact that any further false reporting would result in criminal charges, Karen's voice rose in a panic, but each word only served to tighten the legal noose around her overinflated sense of power. And I stood behind my wife, silently absorbing the spectacle, knowing that what we were witnessing was not just a victory for us personally, but a lesson for anyone who had ever mistaken property lines, HOA regulations, or petty authority for real power, because when the first officer finally stepped forward, gesturing for Karen to step back, and the second unit blocked her exit route from the driveway, the magnitude of her miscalculation became fully apparent, and by the time the final report was filed, detailing every false claim, every attempt at intimidation, and every breach of protocol, the entire neighborhood had learned a harsh truth. No amount of screaming, scheming, or HOA letterhead bravado could override the authority of someone who commanded the state's law enforcement network with the same ease that others might make a phone call to order pizza. And as the sirens finally faded, the crowd dispersed and Eleanor returned to the house, unruffled, smiling faintly at me as if to say, "Another Tuesday." I realized that this confrontation had set a precedent that would echo through every HOA meeting in the county, that Karen's reputation would now carry the stigma of her failure, and that in a single, perfectly orchestrated moment of strategy, authority, and calm precision, my wife had not only defended our home, but had sent a message to everyone watching. Never underestimate the person behind the badge. Never assume a small authority can override true power, and never, ever call 911 thinking it gives you leverage when you're trying to manipulate someone who literally runs the state's police operations, because in the end, the rules of engagement are determined not by who screams the loudest, but by who has the knowledge, resources, and temperament to turn that scream into a lesson in accountability. And as I closed the door behind us, hearing the last echoes of Karen's sputtering threats, carried away by the evening wind, I felt a profound mixture of relief, awe, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some battles are won not with force, but with preparation, intelligence, and the unwavering presence of someone who commands respect without needing to demand it. And that was the story of how HOA Karen's attempt to eject my wife from our home turned into the most spectacular display of authority, planning, and sheer competence the neighborhood had ever witnessed, a moment that would be remembered, whispered about, and probably memed online for years to come, all because she had underestimated one crucial fact: that my wife didn't just enforce the law, she embodied it, and when provoked, she could make an entire system respond with precision, effectiveness, and undeniable authority, leaving anyone foolish enough to challenge her scrambling in a panic that was as inevitable as it was utterly deserved. The second Karen thought she could regroup and try a new angle, her plan immediately began unraveling faster than anyone could have anticipated, because just as she straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath to dial her so-called backup, my wife Eleanor had already anticipated this move, running multiple scenarios in her mind simultaneously, calculating every potential loophole, every avenue of manipulation, every desperate attempt Karen might make to reclaim the illusion of control she thought she had. And as Karen's trembling fingers hovered over her phone, she was completely unaware that Eleanor had discreetly placed calls to every relevant unit in the county, alerting them that any further interference by the HOA president could be considered harassment and obstruction, which meant that by the time Karen had convinced herself to call again, the moment was already lost and her credibility evaporating before her eyes. And this time, Eleanor decided it was time to escalate. But not in a way that would put our safety at risk. She moved through the house like a shadow, fluid and precise, preparing for every conceivable breach, every confrontation, every potential legal entanglement that could arise if Karen escalated to trespassing. Because Eleanor had learned long ago that anticipation is the difference between chaos and control. And while Karen was busy imagining herself as the protagonist of a dramatic confrontation, Eleanor was quietly orchestrating the outcome, coordinating with multiple divisions, checking property deeds, confirming jurisdictional authority, and ensuring that the state police presence could be mobilized instantly without alarming the neighborhood more than necessary. And as Karen finally gathered the courage to step onto our lawn again, still clutching her phone, she froze when a second, more formal set of sirens cut through the early evening calm, and from the angle of our security cameras, which Eleanor had installed strategically. Long before this petty conflict, she could see 3 additional cruisers converging on the scene, not for intimidation, but for the kind of calculated positioning that only someone with her experience could devise, because Eleanor understood the psychology of escalation. She knew how to command presence without aggression, and she knew that when Karen realized that no amount of yelling, no amount of documentation, no amount of HOA authority could override the law, the only reaction left would be fear, and Karen's face, twisted with disbelief and a creeping panic, was proof enough that Eleanor's strategy was working. And as the crowd of neighbors slowly gathered, phones out, whispers growing, some daring to step closer to watch, Karen's every movement became a public spectacle, a cautionary display of what happens when entitlement collides with competence, and in that moment, the air seemed to thrum with tension as Eleanor emerged onto the porch once again, calm and composed, radiating the kind of authority that makes people freeze mid-step and reconsider every decision they thought was clever. And she didn't just speak, she commanded attention, explaining in precise, unflappable detail that Karen had no jurisdiction to demand entry, that any attempt to do so would constitute criminal trespass, and that the state police were fully prepared to enforce every aspect of the law should Karen overstep. And as the words left her mouth, Karen's initial bravado collapsed into stammering, her phone slipping from her fingers, her attempts at justification sounding increasingly hollow against the weight of Eleanor's presence, which was not just physical but procedural, legal, and psychological, because the neighbors were not simply watching, they were witnesses to a real-time dismantling of entitlement, watching how the intricate dance of law, authority, and preparation could reduce a self-important HOA president to a shaking, powerless figure. And as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Eleanor began to methodically call out every misstatement Karen had made, referencing official documents, HOA bylaws, state regulations, and property records with such clarity and precision that even the most skeptical onlooker could see the impossibility of Karen's position. And as Karen tried to interject, Eleanor anticipated each objection, countering preemptively, turning the confrontation into a demonstration of absolute authority. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of the neighborhood, Karen's panic became palpable, her movements increasingly erratic, her voice rising to a pitch that was almost comical if the situation hadn't been so tense. And Eleanor, calm as ever, coordinated with units to secure the perimeter, ensuring that no unauthorized person could interfere, while also making it clear that any further false claims would be formally documented, prosecuted, and publicized if necessary, which left Karen trapped in a shrinking bubble of powerlessness. And as one officer gently guided her away from our property, her face a mixture of fury, shame, and disbelief, it became clear that the confrontation had shifted from a personal dispute to a public lesson in authority, jurisdiction, and the consequences of underestimating someone who not only holds the law but understands how to execute it flawlessly. And in the aftermath, as Eleanor returned to the house, her presence radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence, I realized that this had become more than just an HOA conflict. It was a masterclass in strategic authority, demonstrating that preparation, expertise, and calm decisiveness could dismantle entitlement in real time. And as neighbors murmured among themselves, snapping pictures, recording videos, and discussing the events, it was evident that Karen's failed attempt to assert control would ripple throughout the community for months, maybe years, serving as a cautionary tale, because the moment she had tried to leverage a trivial complaint into action, she had triggered a response from someone who literally commands the law, someone who could mobilize a network of enforcement faster, more effectively, and more decisively than Karen could have ever imagined. And as the evening deepened, the flashing lights faded, and the crowd dispersed, I looked at Eleanor and understood that this was not simply a defensive victory, it was a demonstration of power calibrated perfectly with precision, and that no amount of HOA authority, personal indignation, or false bravado could ever compete with someone who knows the law, commands the law, and executes it with unshakable confidence. And in that quiet, almost serene moment after the storm of lights, sirens, and confrontation, I realized that we had not only defended our home, but set a precedent so absolute that anyone foolish enough to challenge Eleanor Hart in the future would do so at their own peril, and that Karen, who had walked onto our property thinking her phone call could dictate reality, would forever be remembered as the woman who learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that authority cannot be faked, power cannot be assumed, and entitlement can collapse in an instant when faced with true competence, foresight, and unwavering execution, leaving me with a profound sense of relief, pride, and the recognition that some battles are not just fought, they are orchestrated, choreographed, and won before they even begin, and that every future HOA meeting, every petty complaint, and every imagined slight would now carry the shadow of that evening, because the lesson was indelibly clear. Never provoke someone who commands not just respect, but the entire apparatus of law itself. And Eleanor's calm, measured, and devastatingly effective response had ensured that Karen would never ever forget it. The night air was thick with a sense of anticipation that bordered on electricity, as though the entire neighborhood itself had been holding its breath, because even after Karen had been escorted back to her property, the ripples of her failed assault on our home lingered, and Eleanor, ever the strategist, knew that complacency was the enemy, that even a single misstep in perception could allow Karen or any of her emboldened allies to try again, and so she moved through the house with the quiet precision of someone who had faced far worse threats than a frantic HOA president, checking cameras, monitoring neighborhood communications, coordinating with multiple units, and updating databases with the meticulous thoroughness of an operation commander on a high-stakes mission. While I watched, silently aware that the ordinary residents outside had no concept of what was actually happening, that what they perceived as a domestic dispute or HOA drama was, in fact, a fully coordinated deployment of authority and security protocols that would have taken weeks to plan if it weren't for Eleanor's unparalleled experience and foresight. And as the hours ticked by, Karen's obsession with regaining control became almost palpable, her frantic whispers over the phone to neighbors and local contacts carrying through the thin walls of her mansion-like home, plotting her next move, unaware that every communication was being monitored, logged, and analyzed, and that any attempt to manipulate or coerce would not just fail, it would be used against her in formal reports and possible legal action. And as I prepared for what I thought might be the final act of this drawn-out confrontation, the first sign of a new threat emerged when our security system flagged unusual movement near the far boundary of our property, a section Karen had no legal claim to but clearly thought she could intimidate her way into, and before I could react, Eleanor was already on her tablet, pulling up live feeds, adjusting infrared sensors, and deploying a tactical response that was invisible to the casual observer but utterly unmissable to anyone trained to see it, and as a shadow detached itself from the treeline, moving toward the house with a deliberate but erratic gait, it became clear that Karen had enlisted someone a desperate attempt to bypass the legal restrictions and physical barriers Eleanor had established. And in that moment, time seemed to slow, the tension thick enough to taste as Eleanor issued a series of precise, rapid commands over encrypted channels, mobilizing units that arrived almost instantaneously, silently surrounding the perimeter, ensuring no unauthorized individual could breach our defenses, while simultaneously coordinating with legal teams to prepare injunctions, harassment reports, and criminal complaints that would leave Karen fully exposed and liable. And as the intruder neared, lights flashing from unmarked cruisers illuminated the shadowy figure, who froze mid-step, realizing that the house was no longer a simple target, but a fortress under the control of someone who not only expected such attempts but had anticipated them with frightening accuracy. And Eleanor, calm as a chess master observing a pawn advance into a trap, gave a single signal, and officers quietly but firmly detained the individual, who turned out to be a local contractor acting on Karen's instructions, utterly unprepared for the coordinated precision of the response. And in the aftermath, as paperwork was processed, statements taken, and the situation de-escalated without a single shot fired, Karen's panic turned into fury, then desperation, and eventually a quiet, simmering realization that her every scheme had been anticipated, nullified, and documented for permanent record. And yet, Eleanor didn't stop there, because she knew Karen's obsession wouldn't end until she had attempted one final maneuver, and so she deployed a psychological strategy as precise as her tactical one, instructing officers to allow Karen to see the strength of her network, to witness the futility of her actions, and to understand in no uncertain terms that her authority was a fragile illusion compared to the real power controlling the scene. And as Karen paced back and forth, screaming into her phone and gesturing wildly at officers, neighbors now watching from a safe distance, some recording on their devices, the lesson unfolded like a masterclass in control, authority, and strategic patience, because Eleanor's command was not just about stopping intrusion or defending property, it was about asserting dominance over the narrative, demonstrating in real time that competence and foresight always triumph over arrogance and entitlement. And as the night stretched into early morning with flashlights cutting through foggy shadows and officers maintaining discreet but impenetrable positions, Karen's frantic plotting became increasingly erratic, each plan she whispered or typed on her phone immediately countered by protocols Eleanor had established hours, sometimes days in advance. And as she realized that every avenue had been anticipated, that every potential ally was neutralized, and that every action she could take would only deepen her liability, her face went pale, eyes darting nervously, voice cracking under the weight of understanding that she had challenged someone whose reach and competence were absolute. And Eleanor, finally allowing herself a small exhale, moved through the house checking systems, adjusting perimeter defenses and reviewing surveillance footage, knowing that true security is proactive, not reactive, and that the night was not just a defensive victory, but a decisive demonstration of strategic foresight, operational command, and psychological dominance. And as Karen slunk back into her home, defeated, muttering under her breath and realizing she had been outmaneuvered at every turn, Eleanor calmly began the process of debriefing, documenting, and securing the evidence that would protect us for the long term, because the lesson extended beyond this one confrontation, beyond the property lines, and into the public record, ensuring that anyone who might have thought to emulate Karen's arrogance would think twice. And as I watched Eleanor sit at her workstation, lights from security monitors reflecting in her eyes, I understood fully that this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a testament to preparation, knowledge, and the unshakable presence of someone who commands not only respect but real authority, the kind that transforms panic into compliance, fear into awareness, and entitlement into the bitter recognition that some opponents are simply untouchable, not because they wield power recklessly but because they understand it, respect it, and execute it with flawless precision. And as dawn began to break over the manicured lawns of the neighborhood, casting long golden light over the scene of the previous night's drama, Karen's failure would echo in every whispered conversation, every speculative comment online, and every future HOA meeting, because the story of how my wife, Lieutenant Commander Eleanor Hart, neutralized, dismantled, and exposed an overreaching HOA president would become legend in our county, a vivid, almost cinematic illustration of what happens when arrogance meets someone whose power is comprehensive, undeniable, and executed with calm, strategic mastery. And I knew, as I watched Eleanor quietly review every camera feed, log every event, and ensure the security of our home, that the narrative of this battle was firmly under our control, that Karen's attempts to rewrite reality would fail, and that the neighborhood had witnessed firsthand that authority cannot be fabricated, power cannot be assumed, and when faced with someone who embodies both, the consequences of overreach are absolute, inescapable, and unforgettable. The following morning dawned with a quiet tension that belied the chaos of the previous night, a deceptive calm that stretched across the neighborhood like a taut wire waiting to snap, because Karen, bruised in ego and humiliated in public, had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of her failure, and Eleanor, ever vigilant, knew that the final act of this confrontation had to be handled with the same precision, foresight, and strategic mastery that had defined every moment since the first call was made. So while neighbors whispered and speculated about the previous night's events, Eleanor moved silently through the house, reviewing camera footage, cross-referencing property deeds, confirming that all legal filings were in order, and coordinating with her network of state police units to ensure that no further harassment or trespass attempts could occur, because she understood, better than anyone, that victory is not complete until it is secured both physically and legally, and that the fallout from such an incident could linger for years if not meticulously documented. And as Karen paced her property, her face pale and her hands shaking, making frantic calls to anyone she thought might be able to help her reclaim the illusion of control, she was completely unaware that every communication, every movement, and every desperate plan was being logged, analyzed, and countered in real time. And when she finally decided to confront us one last time in person, thinking perhaps a show of intimidation might sway the situation, she was met with the full weight of Eleanor's authority, calm and unyielding as my wife stepped onto the porch once again, her presence radiating the kind of confidence that turns panic into hesitation, arrogance into self-doubt, and that makes even the boldest overreachers realize their errors before they can act. And Eleanor did not need to raise her voice because the law, the strategic positioning of officers, the comprehensive security systems, and her own commanding presence spoke louder than words ever could. And as Karen's eyes darted around, realizing that every possible escape or maneuver had been anticipated and neutralized, the crushing inevitability of her defeat settled over her like a physical weight, a combination of fear, shame, and disbelief that she had ever believed she could assert control over someone who literally operates at the highest levels of law enforcement. And in that moment, Eleanor allowed a faint smile, not of cruelty but of quiet satisfaction, knowing that the confrontation had reached its natural conclusion, and that the lessons of preparation, authority, and competence would be etched into the neighborhood forever. And as Karen backed down, muttering incoherently, I could see the shift in perception across the onlooking neighbors, some nodding subtly in admiration, others whispering about the spectacle they had just witnessed, and a few recording every moment to document how an overconfident HOA president had been dismantled by someone whose authority was absolute. And the legal measures that followed were just as methodical, as Eleanor oversaw the filing of harassment reports, trespass notices, and false reporting complaints, ensuring that Karen's reckless actions would have lasting consequences, not out of malice, but to reinforce the boundaries between entitlement and authority. And as the days progressed, it became evident that the neighborhood itself had absorbed the lesson that petty power plays, inflated egos, and imagined authority could not survive the scrutiny of true competence. and while Karen fumed in her own home, Eleanor continued her work quietly, reviewing surveillance, updating legal documents, and checking that all systems remained secure, because she understood that security is an ongoing process, not a single moment of triumph, and the community, once on edge over what they perceived as drama, now began to treat her presence with a mix of respect and awe, whispering about the calm decisiveness, the flawless execution, and the psychological mastery displayed in dismantling Karen's attempts. And as the weeks passed, Eleanor's influence became a stabilizing force, a reminder that the law and competence are inseparable allies, and that anyone attempting to challenge them without preparation, knowledge, and respect will inevitably falter. And I watched her work with a mixture of pride, relief, and quiet admiration, understanding that her actions had secured our home, protected our lives, and established a precedent that would echo throughout the county, because the story of Karen's failed coup, the neighborhood's witnessing of her unraveling, and Eleanor's flawless command of the situation became a legend, a cautionary tale that illustrated with cinematic clarity the consequences of arrogance, entitlement, and the assumption that small authority can override real power. And as Eleanor finally allowed herself to relax, reviewing logs, confirming reports, and ensuring that every aspect of the encounter had been properly documented, I realized that the victory was complete not just in a physical sense, but in a psychological and strategic sense, because Karen had learned, in the most vivid and undeniable way, that challenging someone of true authority carries consequences far beyond what she could have imagined, and that no phone call, no HOA letter, and no imaginary sense of superiority could ever substitute for competence, foresight, and absolute control over the situation. And in that moment, as sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the house that had become a fortress of strategy, law, and calm precision, I felt a profound sense of security, knowing that the home, the neighborhood, and our lives were protected not by chance, but by the deliberate, unflinching actions of someone who commands authority with intelligence, preparation, and psychological mastery. And as Karen retreated, finally into the shadows of her own making, the neighborhood slowly returned to its rhythm, forever altered by what they had witnessed, and I understood fully that this confrontation, though resolved, would be remembered as a defining moment, a cinematic sequence of power, strategy, and absolute authority, proving that true control is earned, maintained, and executed with unwavering precision, and that anyone foolish enough to test it will find themselves utterly unprepared, outmatched, and left to reflect on their own hubris in the most public, undeniable, and unforgettable way possible. Because in the end, the law, authority, and competence are not abstract concepts. They are embodied, executed, and defended by individuals like my wife. And on that quiet morning, as the neighborhood absorbed the lesson, I knew with certainty that HOA Karen's attempts to assert dominance over us had not just failed, they had become a cautionary legend, a story whispered, recorded, and remembered. 4 years, a cinematic testament to what happens when arrogance collides with true power, leaving no doubt that the outcome was as inevitable as it was perfectly orchestrated, and that our home, our lives, and our peace had been secured by someone whose authority is absolute, precise, and impossible to challenge without catastrophic consequences. Just when it seemed that the storm had passed, that HOA Karen had been thoroughly dismantled and the neighborhood had absorbed the lesson of true authority, an unexpected ripple surged through our quiet streets, because arrogance, once bruised, rarely disappears quietly, and Karen, stubborn to the last, had begun to weave a new scheme, a desperate attempt to regain influence that no longer existed. And while neighbors whispered about the spectacle they had already witnessed, unaware of the deeper machinations unfolding behind closed doors, Eleanor, ever vigilant, had already detected subtle anomalies, unusual vehicle movements, suspicious deliveries, and coded messages circulating in the neighborhood watch channels, all indicating that Karen had not learned the lesson, but rather was attempting to escalate her tactics, which only confirmed what Eleanor had always known. Entitlement is persistent, but preparation is permanent. And as she moved through the house, checking monitors, cross-referencing property boundaries, and reviewing communications, she orchestrated a multi-layered defense, not just reactive but proactive, ensuring that any attempt to intimidate, infiltrate, or manipulate would fail before it even began. And this time, Karen's tactics included not just direct confrontation, but an attempt to exploit local contractors, sympathetic neighbors, and even HOA legal loopholes in a frantic scramble to regain some semblance of control. And as the day progressed, the tension in the neighborhood became palpable, with curious residents peeking from windows, speculating about the heightened presence of unmarked vehicles, silent officers stationed strategically, and the almost imperceptible but commanding aura of authority emanating from our home. because Eleanor had transformed our property into both a defensive fortress and a psychological barrier, signaling, without a single word, that any misstep by Karen or her allies would be immediately detected, documented, and countered. And as Karen made a series of frantic phone calls, each intercepted or monitored through Eleanor's carefully calibrated network, she was forced to realize, piece by piece, that her desperation only tightened the web of accountability around her, and while she imagined herself regaining leverage, every step she took was anticipated, recorded, and analyzed, leaving her increasingly isolated, frustrated, and panicked, which only amplified the tension as officers quietly ensured that no unauthorized entry occurred. Neighbors watched in awe, and I, standing beside Eleanor, marveled at the orchestration, the strategy, and the seamless execution of authority, because what the community was witnessing, though subtle to most, was a masterclass in control, combining legal expertise, tactical positioning, psychological pressure, and the invisible hand of someone who literally commands the state police force. And as afternoon turned into evening, Karen's increasingly erratic attempts to provoke a response were met with calm, calculated countermeasures, from recorded warnings to precise documentation of her harassment, creating a paper trail that ensured any further escalation would carry significant legal consequences. And even as she tried to rally neighborhood sympathizers, her credibility was shattered, her allies hesitant to engage directly, and her influence within the community eroded with every failed attempt, because Eleanor had anticipated not just immediate threats, but the ripple effects of social pressure, misinformation, and public perception, and she used this understanding to maintain control, demonstrating that true authority operates on multiple levels: legal, tactical, and psychological, simultaneously, leaving Karen caught in a tightening spiral of defeat and futility. And as night fell, Eleanor activated additional surveillance layers, coordinated discreet patrols, and ensured that every access point to our property was monitored and secured, transforming our home into a symbol of absolute authority. And as Karen finally appeared at the edge of her property one last time, hoping for a breakthrough that would never come, she was met with the silent, unwavering presence of state police units and a home fortified not just by physical security but by strategic foresight and psychological dominance. And as Eleanor calmly stepped onto the porch, watching the final act unfold, Karen's face betrayed a mixture of fear, resignation, and incredulity, because she had learned in the most undeniable way that attempting to manipulate, intimidate, or coerce someone who commands true authority is not just futile, it is catastrophic. And while Karen fumed and gestured, Eleanor, without raising her voice, signaled the final, decisive measures: documentation of harassment, evidence of trespassing, and legal notices that would forever prevent Karen from overstepping her bounds. And in that moment, the neighborhood collectively understood that what they were witnessing was not merely a personal feud, but a demonstration of the limits of entitlement, the power of preparation, and the unassailable authority of someone who commands respect, law, and strategy with flawless precision. And as Karen retreated into her home, muttering under her breath and realizing that every attempt to regain leverage had failed, Eleanor oversaw the final consolidation of security protocols, documentation, and neighborhood notifications, ensuring that no further escalation could occur. And while the physical confrontation had ended, the psychological and legal victory was absolute, establishing a precedent that would influence every HOA interaction for years. And as I looked at Eleanor, her calm, composed demeanor reflecting the faint glow of security monitors, I understood that this was more than a victory. It was a permanent transformation in the dynamics of our neighborhood, a cinematic lesson in authority, foresight, and competence. And as Karen slunk away, defeated, humiliated, and stripped of the power she had imagined she held, Eleanor's presence alone became a deterrent, a living testament to what happens when arrogance encounters preparation, expertise, and unshakable command. And in that quiet aftermath, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink over a neighborhood forever changed, I felt a profound mix of relief, admiration, and awe, knowing that the battles had been fought, the lessons learned, and the boundaries of authority had been clearly, irrevocably established, because HOA Karen had learned the hard way that challenging someone who commands the law, executes strategy flawlessly, and anticipates every move is a mistake with consequences that echo far beyond a single confrontation, and that our home, our lives, and our peace had been secured by the unparalleled competence, foresight, and authority of Eleanor Hart, who had not only defended our property, but had rewritten the rules for anyone foolish enough to believe that entitlement can rival true power. And as night fully settled, with quiet officers maintaining watch and surveillance systems humming softly in the background, it became clear that this was not just a personal victory, but a legendary sequence of events that would be recounted, whispered, and remembered as a definitive example of how arrogance is dismantled by precision, strategy, and unyielding authority, and that HOA Karen, the woman who had once imagined herself a figure of influence and control, would forever be remembered as the cautionary example of what happens when ambition meets someone who embodies real power, law, and calculated dominance, leaving the neighborhood and anyone who heard the story with an indelible lesson about competence, preparation, and the unstoppable force of someone who does not just enforce the law, but lives and executes it flawlessly in every moment of crisis. And as Eleanor finally stepped inside, surveying her domain with calm satisfaction, the last echoes of Karen's failed maneuvers fading into history, I realized that our home, our family, and our peace had been secured not by chance, not by luck, but by deliberate expert action, executed with flawless precision, and that this cinematic confrontation, witnessed, recorded, and experienced by everyone who had eyes to see it, would be remembered as a defining, unforgettable story of authority, strategy, and the consequences of arrogance, forever cementing Eleanor Hart's legacy as someone whose presence alone guarantees order, respect, and the unassailable enforcement of law.